We're live. We are back live. Just enjoy chocolate. And we're going to be serious.
Feels like Friday. Yeah.
Wait till next week. We're starting back up. We are asked to take up the efficiency for Montville. I've been told that it's not coming to us. But should I say there's a lot of consternation amongst some of the players.
Yeah.
So I don't
Say
know
that
how
is-
that is going to. If anything develops, I will let you know. Okay, Julia, we're going back to property tax credits. Okay. Do we have slides? I'm sure.
Yes. So I'm Julia Richter with Joint Fiscal Office. There is a slide deck on the committee page under my name. And I will say I had the modeling open, the Excel book that I had open to do this work. My laptop, and now my laptop is really slow because the file is too big. So bear with me while I join the Zoom.
Okay.
Big file.
It's a big file.
Any day this week.
Crosses my computer a lot.
No, we do.
It's already ended too.
October birthday, so.
Right.
Burn them up.
We should do
Slip days.
for summer birthdays when you were a kid. We have like pick a fall birthday. You have a spring birthday?
6 months.
Yeah.
October, so I never get recognized on the floor.
April. Well, Allison
June, so
will
I'd like
be
this
happy to do that.
We can arrange that to that.
So are you loading up a second file?
No, I'm ready.
You're just trying to.
Oh, we're.
I'm connected. I'm just waiting. I'm ready.
We didn't listen for these good cheers.
But I,
The slides are on the committee page.
yeah,
There you go.
now they are up.
Okay. Up to there. All right, let's go.
All right. Do you want me to jump into it?
Just jump in.
Jump in. All right. So talking about some preliminary analysis of changes to the property tax credit. Before getting into it, a reminder for everyone, JFO, we're nonpartisan legislative office producing unbiased fiscal analysis. So I'm not trying to provide any sort of legislative recommendations, but just information for your consideration. I know you all know that,
This
but I like
committee
to
is we do not shoot the messenger.
Well, I appreciate that, and here's a reminder for everyone who's also maybe watching. So anyways, talking about today, we'll start out with talking about considerations of modeling. I thought it would be helpful to sort of level set, because with the property tax credit and the house site exemption, a lot of the time folks are asking, well, what if we did it like this? And what if we did it like this? And I thought it'd be helpful to level set, what goes into the modeling and why is it generally a pretty complicated answer. Then we'll talk about if there were to be no property tax credit, what would that look like? If there were to only be the circuit breaker, that's up to 47,000, what that would look like. And then some final notes that I was thinking about while I was doing the modeling. So starting out, reviewing the property tax credit level setting, you'll recall that Vermont's homestead property tax has a credit based on income. About 2/3 of Vermont households receive this credit of some size towards their property tax bill. Essentially what it is it's looking at how much would you pay on property, how much would you pay on income. If you would pay less on income than you pay on property, the difference is credited to you on the following year's tax bill. That's when we're referring to the lag, we're talking about that following year. And there's some parameters for how the property tax credit is calculated. So there's those income buckets for household income, right? Household income is essentially all of the income under that household roof. And there's also parameters regarding house site value. So depending on the household income, then the property tax credit can be calculated on either 400,000 of house site value up to 90,000 or 225,000 if above.
But we haven't raised those value sides a lot.
We lowered them in 2018. Right? From 500 to 400.
The Senate has traditionally tried to raise it. The House has traditionally tried to lower it.
We wanted to.
We probably did. It was probably the year we were fighting over a 5 or 6% increase.
It was.
So yeah, those parameters don't change every year. JFO, actually in our fiscal facts, we do have a history of changes that have been made to the property tax credit and income sensitivity going back to 1970. So if you're interested in if and how it's changed over time, that's helpful. And then the last piece I want to note here is that there's no statutory upper threshold for when a household will no longer qualify for a property tax credit. Instead, it's a math exercise that JFO and tax do in consensus each year. So essentially, we look at where the property tax line crosses the income tax line. At what point is it always going to be cheaper for you to pay on property than it is to pay on income? And that's the relationship of the two yields. So for fiscal year 2025, that figure is 115,000 of household income. So that changes every year.
Does it just go up a little bit every year?
Over the past year, it's going down. And one of the primary reasons that it's going down has to do with the growth of income and the growth of property. So if you think about the way that those relationships change, property values are growing faster than income. So it's shifting the break-even point lower.
Okay.
Property tax credit, it's an expenditure. It's a tax expenditure in the education fund. It impacts property tax rates and liabilities, bills. Saying liabilities all throughout the presentation, but I'm referring to bills, essentially. The property tax credit earned in fiscal year 2025 is estimated to cost $153 million. You'll recall that lag. So if you look at the Ed Fund outlook, you'll see that $153 million in fact reflected in FY26. But the credit earned was earned in fiscal year 25. We book it as a negative revenue in the education fund. It shows up in that revenue lines of the Ed Fund outlook. And that's often we refer to, the net homestead property tax, but it's a direct cost to the education fund. So all else being equal, property tax rates need to be raised in order to ensure that the property tax credit is enough revenue is coming in. And the total amount of the property tax credit, the 153 million or whatever it may be, is based off of a ton of stuff. Including parameters in current law, like the 400 and 225 that we spoke about, the 90,000. It also has to do with the homestead and income yields for the fiscal year. Last year, you'll recall the Guild bill increased the property tax credit by 13% one time. And of course, it has to do with household circumstances at the individual level, right? The more folks that either qualify for a credit or don't qualify for a credit impact the overall cost of the credit. So, why is it hard to estimate changes to the property tax? It is hard. And why is it complicated? I guess it's really because it's an iterative process. The Ed Fund is self-leveling, right? So what that means is first we look at how much is being expended, and then we look at how much needs to be raised that's not being raised on non-property taxes to make up that difference. And that's a policy choice that you'll all grapple with in the Yield bill. But because it's self-leveling, changes to the property tax credit require multiple modeling exercises to understand how bill changes will be impacted. So what does that mean? It means first, we have to look at how much do the savings or costs of changes to the property tax credit, how much are they estimated to be? Right? If we're increasing the property tax credit, that means we're gonna have to raise more money. If decreasing the property tax credit, we're gonna raise less. We then need to recalculate the property tax credit, the property tax rates based on the change in credit. So if we're increasing the credit, we need to increase rates to raise that additional money of the increasing credits. But then because we then have changed rates, we need to go back and re-estimate the credit because the rates are changing, which means that the credit itself is also changing. So then the credit changes. And then we say, okay, we have a change in credit. Now we have to raise a different amount of money. We have to go back and re-estimate the rates. So then we go and recalculate the rates, and then we need to re-estimate the credit. And I'll stop that circular process, but that's
Another
because
hamster that does this?
What point
No,
are
it's
you
me.
saying that?
What time do you stop?
Well, that's the question. And so
That's why we haven't been encouraged to make changes.
so that's the question. And I think I talk about that either on the next slide or the following slide. One of the questions is, well, if you're not going to put that money back to rates, then you kind of break the iterative cycle, right? If you say, okay, this property tax credit change is going to cost 40 million more, but we're not going to raise that 40 or 100 or 4 million more on rates, it won't matter, right? Because we're not going to need to recalculate the rates. If it is going to go back into rates, then you either have to keep going through the process and see how it slowly changes over time. You get closer and closer to the final number.
So if we aren't going to take it, if we aren't going to put it back in the rates, we have to raise that money somewhere else.
Elsewhere.
And is that where the folks that are talking about going to an income base? Because the people are paying on their income or their property, but there's a limit. Is that the whole that an income base would fill?
I don't want to speak to, there's probably some people
Okay,
somewhere.
is that a
but,
possible way to fill that hole?
I guess it would depend on how it's structured,
Okay,
right? If it's changes to the property tax credit itself, or the income rates that exist within the education fund, that's very different than if you were to implement maybe an income surcharge and transfer some of those funds from the general fund, or there's all sorts of different, or a general fund transfer according to how much is being raised. I mean, there's certainly different ways to go about it. And I will say, I'm not putting this up here to say like, it's really hard to model and complicated, so don't do it. I'm putting it up here to sort of level set in terms of the world that we're living in and the complexity of the numbers.
don't
Because
change it today and ask you to have the estimate by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning.
that, and also, I think something that I've been reflecting on with thinking about changes of the property tax credit is, usually I have enough like time and brain space and brain capacity to be able to go down all of the paths I want to go down. And you don't always see all of the paths, but like, oh, someone I bet is going to ask about this. Let's see what that would look like. Or with the property tax credit, I haven't gone down every path because it's complex. So I guess that's really
Okay,
this.
I think we're getting that. Yes.
Yeah, so what are the assumptions in this modeling here? I'm not modeling a policy proposal. Really, this testimony today and this modeling exercise is sort of aiming to understand one bound of the world that we're living within, right? We have this property tax credit model, and when people ask about changes or adjustments to it, one of the natural first questions is, well, what is the furthest extreme that we can go in one direction? And one of those directions is, what if there was no income sensitivity at all, right? What would that look like? So we talked about how it's complex, needs multiple assumptions. So here are the assumptions that I have included in this modeling. I'm only looking at filers who qualified for property tax credit in fiscal year 2025, because we don't have good data for above that, because if you are above 115,000, you're told you're not going to qualify for a property tax credit. So there's no reason to fill out that extra paperwork to tell the tax department, you know, your household income and all of that, because you're not going to get one anyways. I am working with tax to get better data to perhaps go further into this, but that's what we're looking at right now. I'm also just ignoring the lag and pretending that the lag doesn't exist and say, okay, what if the property tax, let's just look at it as though the property tax credit that was earned in FY25 is also applied in FY25. So we can actually look at what do those taxpayers owe from FY25. And then just the general holding everything constant, assuming nothing else is changing in a very changing world. So this is who we're looking at. These are the filer groups in the data. So this is for fiscal year 25. We're looking at households under 115,000 of household income for the purpose of calculating the property tax credit. And so there's upwards of 170 something thousand homesteads in the state, household filers, but we're only looking at about 105 of them because they filed for that property tax credit with a household income below 115,000. The way to read this table, and there's a lot of tables in here that follow this structure. So just to be really explicitly clear, we've got the household income groups here on the left-hand side. Those reflect what the tax department has shown you in their house site exemption modeling, which is why they've been chosen. I do want to note to you that the bins are not uniform. So it's not 0 to 25, 25 to 50.
Right.
I believe that they landed at the 47 because that's what the circuit breaker is.
Yeah.
It's just a slight difference, and I want to raise the flag that this is not necessarily these are not uniform bins. So that's what we have here for household income group. Up here we've got that equalized house site value group. So you'll recall equalized means 100% of fair market value. In this instance, house site value, that's that principal dwelling and surrounding 2 acres that the PTC applies to, and the different groups. Also not equal bin sizes, but following what the tax department did. So essentially the way to read this is we see that for households with an household income between 0 and 25,000 of household income, and a house site value between 0 to 100,000, there are about 2,100 house sites in that group. I rounded to 10, so it's a little bit easier to read. I've also included on this slide their average liability under current law. So this is if that FY25 credit were to be applied in FY25. And it follows the intuition that we would expect. We can see really where those kind of cutoff points are within the system, right? So we have the most significant average liability above 400,000 because that's where the property tax credit cannot be applied above that amount.
So this in the previous slide, if you go back one, I see that there are 12,700 households with over $400,000 in income. I'm sorry, or 400,000 is a house value. 12,700 households, and they are getting a good deal compared to that's 12,000 out of 105,000. But then if you go to the next slide, they're getting the maximum amount of property tax credit. Is that what this last?
No, this is showing solely their overall bill. So
Okay, oh, they were built
your
out the
quotes
discount. Okay,
between 90,000 and 115,000 for household income.
Thank
With a house site value over 400,000, their average bill is about 6,600.
Thank you. I thought this was the discount.
Yeah.
I don't have a slide for discount. But this is assuming, this is including their discount. This is including the property tax credit. So this is how much they paid on property minus if they are going to receive a credit, our estimated credit. What is their net bill? That's what we're seeing. Their average net bill is what we're seeing.
If you're 0 to 25,000, you're, okay. Then your house value is, so if you're over 400,000. And that's just the house at 2 acres, right?
Correct.
Okay, then your bill is 21.5, that might be raking in the people with trust funds that buy their condo and then live on a modest income. I'm assuming at some point when you need a new Porsche, you might end up at the 400,000 for that year with no credit. I mean, we've had people that
They do that.
want that.
Yeah.
I think they're not the
Good.
norm, but they do make the front page of the local paper.
So there might be the trustafarians, however you want to describe it, but the other group I'm worried about, and I'm gonna stand up here and do a Vanna White thing. But this group right here, because the tax proposal that came forward from Jake would have, if I recall correctly, they with more house relative to income would pay a lot more. And now the other, besides the trustafarians, who I think fall in this group, and I know a lot of these people, Vermonters that got the house from their parents. A lot of people I know that I went to school with, I'm one of them. I'm living in the house I grew up in. I haven't gone very far in life. It's just sort of, it happens in Vermont. So they get a house worth more than they necessarily can afford because it's just, that's the housing you can find in Vermont. And the other group I'm worried about here are those that, dropped their income. So if they were a 2-income household and then things happened and then they went down, but they bought the house before they went to 1 income, they're making things work.
You bought your house 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Paid $40,000 for it, and it is now, without your doing any major addition, appraised at 400,000. Your income, and now you're living on whatever you've saved in Social Security. I mean, that's this huge spike. Now, if it goes according to history, it's going to crash, but we don't have a surplus of housing, so that it's going to crash and come back to where that house is worth 200,000 is not that likely. But the rapid increase in the price of housing has further skewed that because, and our age, our demographics is becoming heavily weighted in that top sector of people who are either retired or about to be retired. So
there's some low income people with high house value.
with high house value and no place to realistically move within the state. And so you penalize people for that.
Tax them out of their home.
And with nowhere to go. Except move in with their kids. Maybe their kids could move in their house, but that's assuming your kids want to be there.
I'm struggling with this. So
I'm struggling
Yeah.
too, and I'm falling into that category now. So my husband just had to retire. He was, mandatory retirement. I'm making the big bucks here. But it's not really covering my property tax, to be honest. And our house has really gone way up in value. I
Yeah.
live in the north end of Burlington and it's near the lake and,
Yeah.
so we are gonna have some tough decisions to make. I hear you, and we are sitting on a really valuable property. So I'm also struggling.
You also have the factor that some of these people have mortgages, some do not.
Some do.
Yeah,
I mean, I have been surprised by people who've owned their houses for decades or have been living in their houses.
Yeah,
You will find that they have taken out mortgages to send their kids to school. to do a variety of things, fix up after a flood.
Yeah.
So it is not a given that they are not paying for the house. I think it's probably as many different circumstances as there are people. Some of them are staying home and taking care of a loved one with Alzheimer's, and moving a person with Alzheimer's to a different house has severe ramifications in many cases, that it just blows whatever touch you have with reality.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay.
There is no fair way to do this for everyone.
No.
Chris, did I see your hand? No,
It was my hand.
it was
No.
your hand.
Mostly, I was just gonna say, I think Julia has more slides
Yeah.
to show us what happens if you get rid of
Okay.
income sensitive.
So we've decided that there's nothing that is fair for everybody. We can
And it's
move
not
on.
easy. We're talking about the balloon here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Pushing up the balloon. And to the conversation that you were just having, I, before moving on this slide, I will just, when thinking about those groups that you're thinking about that either have more wealth in their income or in their property value, this helps give a distribution of how many households are fitting into those different categories. So that might be a helpful resource. So moving forward, that's kind of level setting, current law, what we're talking about. Want to know preliminary estimates, sense of scale and intuition could be refined. So moving into modeling no income sensitivity in FY25. So what would that mean? If there are no income sensitivity for fiscal year 25, then property taxes would need to raise 153 million less than under current law, right? All else equal. And if this 153 million lower, this could be given to homestead property tax rates, non-homestead rates, or both, or some combination of both. So what I did was I said, okay, let's look at what happens if there were to be no property tax credit, because you have some households, and we'll look at this, that currently are eligible. They fall into those parameters. They receive a property tax credit, but in fact, their liability would be lower. Their bill would be lower if there were no income sensitivity at all. So to estimate what that would look like, who it would impact, I did three things. First, I applied that 153 million to lowering. I went back into my FY25 tax rate yield model and used that 153 million to lower tax rates. I then used the new rates to calculate what the bill would be for all of the households that we were just looking at. And then I compared their current law liability, what we were just looking at, the net homestead property taxes, to the new liability, what it would have looked like if there were to be no property tax credit and nothing else were to change. So there are two ways to do it, or I guess there's infinite ways to do it. I did it two ways. One is I said, let's use that 153 million to uniformly lower the homestead rate and the non-homestead rate, right? It's bringing that average bill change down uniformly. And what we're seeing here in this table, the table is structured in the same way as what we were just looking at. Those cells highlighted in blue are reflecting the groups that on average would see a decrease in their property tax bill. Parentheses, right, as accounting that's negative. So for instance, we're seeing, household income between 47,000 and 75,000, and a household value between 0 and 100,000 would see on average a $70 decrease in their property tax bill if there were no property tax credit and it were to uniformly lower homestead and non-homestead bills. Big picture, what does this look like? Or sort of what are we seeing here? Well, we're seeing that the lower income groups would see the largest average increase in liability, largest increase in their bill, while the groups with incomes above 90,000, and I guess this one as well, would see no change or decreases in their liability.
every non-homestead taxpayer would get a significant decrease.
That's correct.
Yeah.
As well as, thank you, yes, so in this case, we're applying it to homestead and non-homestead, so every non-homestead.
Right.
As well as every household above 115,000, because we're lowering the rate by pretty significant.
And these blue squares.
Yeah, so we're only looking right now at, right, those folks who are, those households that may be eligible for a property tax credit because their household income is up to 115,000. And that's primarily because of current data constraints that I'm working with tax to resolve.
Okay, but looking at this, those making 0 to 25,000 and have a house under 100,000 would see an increase.
Correct.
So the poorest with the worst property would see an increase in their property taxes.
That's right.
Yeah, and intuitively, that makes sense, right? Because we've got, and this is
Most of the
Right.
Yeah.
alluding to the next half of the presentation, but up to 47,000, these are the households that are eligible for the circuit breaker, right? They can only pay a certain percentage of their income. So the most generous property tax credit is up to 47,000. So that's where we see sort of that first line of folks who are going to see their increase.
And that's only the state property tax, right? And up to 47 is state and municipal.
That's correct. So and I do have a slide here in a couple of slides that outlines the circuit breaker, but the circuit breaker is on the state property, education property tax and municipal property tax, both for household incomes up to 47,000. However, the state education property tax is paid out of the ed fund and the muni circuit breaker is paid out of the general fund. So the education fund only covers the circuit breaker for 47,000.
Okay, I'm just wondering if we do away with it, then your municipalities are also going to gain or lose tax. You'll pay more in local taxes.
So if you were to say, we want to do away with all, and I'm not, if anyone's watching online, I'm not saying that this is
Right, well,
but if you were to say, we're doing,
this is brainstorm.
yeah, if you were,
No, we are not brainstorming.
if you were to say we're doing away with all income sensitivity in the property tax credit system, in the education fund system, I'd want to talk to John, West Council, but that in theory wouldn't impact the municipal circuit breaker because that's a general fund expense and it's on municipal taxes.
We're just talking about the education.
I'm only talking about statewide education property taxes, yeah. So what I'm doing here is an average bill decrease for homestead and non-homestead, that's how I'm applying the 153 million. And then I said, well, what if we applied all 153 million solely to homestead taxes? And that's what we see on the next slide. So as would be expected, because we're using now, instead of half of the 153 million, we're using all of the 153 million to buy down homestead, we see more homestead taxpayers would see a decrease in liability. And I think this is really interesting to look at solely just from a modeling perspective, where we see that, you know, a significant number of households that are eligible for the property tax credit would actually see a decrease in their bill if there were no property tax credit. That being said, we still see, as you all noted on the previous slide, we still see that the lowest income groups would see the most significant increases in their property taxes.
And the highest under this scenario would see the highest decreases. If you're making $114.99 and you live in a house valued at $400,000, you're going to see a $1,300
Increase.
in
Tax decrease. On
There's the
average.
guy that is making 25,000 and is living in wondering if a house valued under 100,000 right now, even has indoor plumbing, but probably needs repairs, you're gonna pay $390 more.
Correct.
It's under 100,000. Maybe somewhere you can get a habitable house, but I would think most of those are some form of manufactured home.
Yeah, it could be an unlandable home.
I look at this as if your house site is more than 3 times your household income,
Okay, yeah.
you would pay a little bit more. If you're on the other direction, you pay less.
Wait, say that again?
The way I read this is if your house site is more than 3 times your income, eliminating the property tax credit, you pay more. If you're less than 3 to 1, you pay less. So I read it.
It's not necessarily true.
I mean, it's a generality, but where would it work?
Well, make $100 grand. You're gonna have less property.
Yeah, I mean, on the fringes, but in general speaking, maybe it's 3.2 or something. I don't know. In general.
Okay.
I appreciate this analysis. The one comment I made to Senator Beck earlier today is, I get an idea of where we're going with this, but I come back to, I'm worried, and I would go back to Austin Davis's testimony last year, which was quite persuasive, where he laid out a townhome, 2 identical houses of same square footage size, side by side, 2, let's say 5,000 square foot homes. Well, one of the houses has, it's a big house. One house has 2 adults. The other one has 2 adults and 3 kids. Okay, so the 2 adults, no mortgage, plenty of capital, low income, 40, 50,000, who knows, whatever, but they have no mortgage. They're doing okay. And they're just living on low income. The other half, 2 income household, mortgage, trying to put their kids through college, get say a college fund, do some vacations. Are they getting the property tax credit if they're making 150K? They're not, but the home, the same amount of square footage and the 2 adults is. So I feel like if we're gonna go after the property tax credit, I'd like to look for more discerning characteristics of those applying for it based on their wealth. And that's where the wealth attestation started a lot of this conversation. But that's where I think we could actually streamline the property tax credit to have it only go to those more worthy and deserving of it. And I think that might be relative to occupancy.
A,
too.
I'd be very careful about using the word worthy and deserving. And B, we did that once on the advice of a good Republican accountant. And the idea was that if you reported on your household income that you had investment income, unearned income, normally the norm is you never draw down more than 1/14. And so he thought we should estimate your wealth at, I think it was 14 times what you drew down. We just said you had to double count what you, do you know how many retirees there are in this state? Because they all contacted us. And most of them were drawing down significantly more. I mean, than the 14.
But just my point is, I'm not going
No,
after
I
the
mean,
retirees, I'm going
it
after
gets-
those that have it easier.
And if the market crashes this week or next week, people that were very wealthy are now very poor, depending on how good they are at investing.
And the last point I make on it is where I came to resolve is maybe there's an avenue, it's not gonna happen this year, where we take the proportion of occupants relative to square footage, which we do capture in our tax code. We capture how much square footage there are for homes, and we start to apply property tax credit relative to the density of the homestead. That might be another approach to incentivize better usage of our housing stock. And then also only applying the property tax credit for those that are housing more individuals per square footage in that space.
So where do I move?
That's part of the problem. This is a 2 to 3 year solution or conversation.
Yeah, I mean,
Think that
if
goes-
we had an abundance,
Sure.
an overabundance of smaller homes, then, and we needed to move people down, We did that in Montpelier in the eighties. Early eighties, late seventies, we built condo projects. And the value went up so fast because the demand was so large, we had to go back and reappraise them. People ended up paying the same property taxes. But we don't have an abundance anymore. That's when my neighborhood turned over to the Virgin. The bunch of them moved up the street. So we have a housing. So
I just see reform in the qualifications
Yeah.
of PTC, and that's where I think the discussion could merit more flexibility in the ed fund while also fair tax policy.
I think my worry on that, Tom, would be going back to your worry about those people in the 0 to 25 up in that 3 to 400. Will that be the exact person that has a big house that they maybe inherited from a family? And they don't have a lot of income, but they have a lot of house, and it's 1 or 2 people living in it later in life, whatever. And then you're gonna penalize them.
If you did it proportional to their occupancy to square footage, it would incent mother-in-law apartments, it would incent roommates, it would incent better housing stock density.
Can we hear the rest?
Yeah. My apologies for derailing the conversation. Just-
No, it's okay. I just want to feel like I want to hear everything she.
yeah, let's go through Julia's because I need to leave in about 15 minutes.
All right, well, we are getting there. I also thought this was it's really interesting.
Yeah.
So we just looked at, doing away with income sensitivity in its entirety. And now talking about, okay, what if, I thought that this may be the next question where policymakers are looking and they're like, well, the households with the lowest income are seeing the largest increases. So I said, okay, what if we kept only the circuit breaker and then we did away with all income sensitivity above 47,000? Then how would it shake out? So this is a reviewer slide of what the circuit breaker is, right? So we have within the ed property tax, specific income sensitivity for households with household income 47,000 or below. And essentially what it means is those households cannot pay their more than a certain percentage of their income on education tax. It's part of the property tax credit. But it's a certain provision within the income sensitivity structure. Also referred to as circuit breaker. And in FY25, the income sensitivity for this group under 47,000 for the circuit breaker was about 70 million. So this is 70 million of the 153 million. So a little under half is dedicated to households with incomes up to 47,000. And again, I'm only talking about the state education property tax circuit breaker. The muni portion is general fund. Not talking about it all here.
Okay.
Although they do live in the same place in statute. So I modeled it in the same similar way that we just walked through. I said, okay, we're gonna keep that circuit breaker as though nothing is changing. But we're getting rid of the property tax credit above the 47,000, which means we have about 83 million less that we don't need to pay out in a property tax credit than under current law. So again, how do we distinguish the 83 million? Where does it go? It could go to homestead, it could go to non-homestead, it could go to both. I did the same pattern that I did. I just walked through. To estimate the change, the same 3 steps are conducted. We take the 83 million, use it to lower rates, use those new rates to calculate the new bills, and then compare the current law bill to the new bill. This is a place where I do want to flag. I said stop after one go around. So that's what this note here is. So because of that iterative process of like the cost changes, the cost of the circuit breaker becomes less expensive because rates are lowered. So we don't need to credit households as much. So in this case, there were about 4 million in savings that I didn't use to put back towards rates. They're just like kind of sitting in a pot.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
Um,
you can stop doing the circular
yeah, so
at some point.
Senator Matos's point of when you stop, I said stop.
Perfect.
So this is if we were to use that 83 million to uniformly buy down homestead and non-homestead bills. I'm not including the 47 up to 47,000 here because we're not changing anything. So I thought it'd be simpler if we didn't have a bunch of zeros to look at. Right, because there's no average change because we're not touching their liability. So what we're looking at here is those households between 47 and 115. And what we see now is the bubble is squeezed again, and it's squeezing right up to that 47,000 to 75,000 line. Right? Because that's where there would have been the most generous property tax credit that is being done away with. So that's where we're seeing it pop up. And again, we're not talking about the average decrease that households above 115,000 would experience, nor non-homestead. And of course, the folks up to 47,000 that are paying some property taxes because they have house site values that are more than 400,000, they also see a decrease in their liability.
And again, over 150 would be blue and non-homestead would be.
And then I did the same thing, but I said we're gonna put all 83 million to homestead solely. And here we see the balloon still pushes in the same place, but that the savings come down closer to the lower house site values, right? We see that balloon shifting. And the intuition Senator Beck just mentioned also remains the same here as well.
That's 83 million. Did you, Julia, those 8 cells that they have to pay more, the damaged, yeah. What's the sum total of that damage? Did you calculate that?
Yes. But you'll need to give me I have my model up. The savings, for the folks going back to removing the property tax credit and giving it all to homestead, the sum total of the increase in liability would be about 90 million.
So these,
But not this. I'm the number that I have in front of me is this.
that's 90 million.
This is 90 million.
Okay. I guess the other one would be something less than 90 million.
This is just big one. That's about 55 million.
55 million damage
Mhm.
on the,
Wait, the corner one?
not that slide.
Sorry. I'm pivoting the thing.
On that slide, $55 million. of
50, and this is the final slide.
Yeah, 20. I think I have a final notes slide, but
This is only the circuit breaker and
Yeah.
all one goes to homestead base.
What? I wonder, about.
Oh, sorry, this title is wrong. I don't know why. All of the numbers are correct, but this shouldn't say and non-homestead property taxes uniformly.
Oh, would you just
It
say?
just should
reduce
say
the homestead?
homestead.
Oh,
I'm gonna remember.
on slide 20.
Yes.
Scratch that third line.
Yeah.
So just bring it down that. 47,
You said
75.
that's
Mhm.
$5 million in damage there for those 8 squares?
Yeah,
What's that?
What about the,
You said it's 55 million that those 8 squares
white-
cost?
Those 8 squares pay $55 million more than they do in the current one.
In order, it's self-equal level.
I wonder if I mean, 47,000 has been in law for a long time. And if we raised that or sloped it, how that would change the boxes. So that,
To 50. It used to be 35.
well, maybe moving it to 50 and then sloping it up to, so they get a smaller benefit to try to help these 8 squares to take less of the damage.
I mean, 47 to 75 is not a lot of income.
Exactly.
At $100,000 house. It's pretty minimal in today's market. It is probably a mobile home in a park. And yeah,
I wonder if, this is kind of filled into Jake's world, but if Jake could model a, house value exemption rules that would take care of.
That you put on top of the tax credit, basically.
No, it would be in, remember, this is no tax, no PTC.
This is no T, but it still is a circuit breaker. So that,
Right, but I'm saying that so this is,
maybe I need to leave Senator June.
yeah, so it would be on top, it would be on something. on
Yeah.
top.
so
Don't
keeping
vote
the,
on
because
anything
what
till
he
I
did,
have
when
that.
he modeled it, was he got rid of the circuit breaker and the top tax credit, right? Jake's model.
Yeah,
So
so this
keeping
would be,
this, keeping the circuit breaker and then doing something, whether it's sloping the circuit breaker in some way based on both income and property
No voting.
value. Or doing something, I hate to layer 2 different types of things on top of each other, so that's why I'm trying to
Yeah.
figure out is there a way to stay within the construct of the circuit breaker, but to slope it more so it doesn't have this stark cutoff with these 8 squares.
Or no.
Thank you. Good question, Senator Hardy, but I have a much more. I'm probably coming way out of left field, but can you just tell me what problem are we trying to fix here? I'm sorry. What are we actually contemplating this as a model?
For me, I think the problem we're trying to fix is we have a property tax credit system where 60,000 people that are getting a property tax credit are receiving no benefit. In fact, they're getting the opposite of benefit.
So hasn't, for example, Public Assets proposed some slight changes to the
PTC
threshold?
I don't know.
They did propose some changes to the thresholds, but I think but I don't know what their modeling is, but what I think, just to reiterate and say a little differently than Scott said, is that the property tax credit right now is not working for some of the people who it's supposed to benefit.
60% of
Yeah,
Yeah.
quite a bit of them, and just raising that income level and that the property value level might actually
hurts.
hurt some more people.
Yeah.
So modeling it this way is trying to figure out like, okay, if we're gonna what is the best use of the $153 million that we put into the property tax credit right now? Is it to change the income thresholds and the house site thresholds in a different way to benefit more people? Or do we put the money back in and lower everybody's property taxes? And where is the threshold of benefit there?
I think there's also a perception, and I think this is I think it's a problem for our school boards, which is, this year, the average tax rate pre-sale is like $1.67.
I don't trust.
60 cents of value, 60 cents of that
Give me in the wall
$1.67
and I'm gonna share.
is to pay for the property tax credit.
Say that again.
About 60 cents of that $1.67 is to pay for the property tax credit. And I think for our school boards that are like having to sell $1.67, 60 cents of that has nothing to do with their education spending decision. It has to do with the property tax credit. It shows up in that rate that they're showing to their voters.
Okay, yeah.
I think it's a bad perception.
I mean, the issue, part of the issue too, is just the language, modeling no income sensitivity. We are talking about income sensitivity here.
Yes.
No income sensitivity beyond the
certain
certain.
On this
Yeah,
one,
right, on this one. And the other ones, they're different. Each one
Right,
is a little
each one is different. No, I know, thank you.
We could do an infinite number of combinations and permutations of what we might do. I would be very interested in comparing, for example, the recommendations of the Public Assets Institute with, say, the Tax Foundation. Two entirely different points of view as to whether they, because again, I'm not sure, are we the best people
Right.
to write tax rates?
Scott,
Other than review
Well-
tax rates and the methodology, how people arrived at them, whether or not they do what was intended to do. And that's how we make our judgment. But as laymen, I'm not sure that we're the competent people to design tax rates.
Well, I guess I'm gonna push back on that a little while, because I think what Julia has done is to model.
Oh, we can model,
Where-
look at the result,
where
but I'm
it-
also
and
I'm just
then
concerned
try to
about the
find-
unintended consequences of what we do.
Well, I think that what has happened is that in the past, that I've never seen this modeling before, where we've taken out the tax credit and tried to figure out who it's actually benefiting
Mhm.
and where the thresholds are on the incomes and the house site values. So I do think that we can sort of try to figure out where's that sweet spot. Now, not everybody is going to be a winner, but how can we find that sweet spot?
Thank you. And also thank you, Julia. I really appreciate all the work that's gone into this. I mean, I'm just having, so long. Update. But my other question is, we're doing this on top of this behemoth of an education plan that requires redistricting, changing the funding formula. I mean, it's all at once. And I shouldn't be looking at Julia, I'm looking at all of us. It just seems like a ridiculous amount of work to be trying to contemplate right now.
I just think it's a great time to do it. If you're changing
Wow.
the education funding formula, you should.
You're.
I think the overall goal of this plan is so that the people in this building can explain it to the people back home. Because right now, how many people in this building can explain to somebody how we get to their tax bill?
How many people understand federal tax code? I mean,
Well,
tax
this is,
code is our.
I have no bearing on federal tax code. I have an ability to change education finance in Vermont.
I think for me, sorry, for me, like, I think this is really interesting because it actually, we could impact a lot of we could lower a lot of people's property taxes with just changing where the thresholds are. And it's actually it's not a huge change. And I mean, we could even just stay with the current formula and just tweak the levels, and it would have an impact on lowering people's property taxes. I think there's been a lot of assumption, and I probably made the assumption myself, that the more money you put into the property tax credit, the better it is, right? It seems like that's the way it should be.
Yeah.
But I think what this modeling is showing is that not necessarily, or better for whom. And so I think that we could make some changes to the, like I was saying, like the income levels and the house site values to try to find a sweet spot that is better and a more efficient use of the $150 million that we're putting into it right now.
I'm gonna call on myself.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I want to say the other problem or opportunity, I think that this is inspired from, I would invoke what Jake Feldman presented. Feldman presented that if you have a large house value and low income, Vermont's the best state to live in. Other states like Maine or elsewhere, they would tax you at much higher rates, which is effectively what their notion is putting forward. And that's why we would have that tax deferral system, because if we adjusted our tax code to draw more money in to the ed fund and lighten the burden on others, it would impact those with a large house value and lower incomes because they would pay more.
Mhm.
So that's where I bring it back to qualifications. So who's getting the PTC is where I could see value in us raising more money from people that have the ability to pay. We're running out of time. And
No.
two of us are supposed to be down the hall, but we'll keep going. Did you have something to say?
No, I was just gonna say, it's really hard to determine the ability to pay. Like, if you're looking at those three levels of income and then pick any one of those house values, a person that's making $47,000 a year and they got a house at 400,000, they could have a lot higher ability to pay because they paid their place off. They got it from their parents, whatever, as opposed to that person making 115,000 in a $100,000 house or $200,000 house, and they got a mortgage to the hills on it. And it doesn't determine, just based on your income, your ability to pay.
And then there's the Mickey Mantle baseball card collection too.
I'm gonna start bringing,
Yeah, right.
Bought one.
I'm bringing in my Mickey Mantle. I have one. It's a replica. I have.
We're gonna put it up on our bulletin board.
Bring it in glass case.
From an economist perspective, I think it'd be good policy to tax those with higher house value because it would incent better housing choices that better matches our housing stock to what their needs are. But it's very bad. It's hard politics. We would effectively be taxing people with low incomes more.
Yeah.
And they would have to tax their.
And you're penalizing someone's asset that they paid off over 30 years for somebody at the very beginning.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
No.
Chris, he speaks the least in this committee.
Last one, warm it up.
Oh, we're talking about real estate.
Okay, well, I have a question for Julia, which is how. This is a loaded question. Like, how hard is it to run these models if we gave you different parameters to try to be like, oh, can you tweak it this way?
Yeah, and no, I think it ultimately depends on what kind of tweaks we're talking about. And I'm happy to help you pursue that. And it is, I don't want to say it's a significant amount of work because that makes it sound as though we're not going to do it. It's just to be aware of, it's not like I push a one in and
Like,
then
it'd be
No,
like something well thought out.
yeah, so,
Yeah.
and certainly, if this is something that you're interested in exploring, if I may, just a couple of comments that I think would be helpful. I do want to remind the committee that what we're looking at here is removing, doing away with the property tax credit or doing away with the circuit breaker. My understanding, I think the public assets modeling came up. My understanding is that, I haven't looked at it in a while, is that it would cost, and they've estimated, I haven't replicated it, estimated it would cost about 50 or 60 million more to do their expansion.
Expansion of the.
However, that 50, I don't know, and this is a question for them. I would just encourage you to think, has the modeling been done, including that 50, 60 million, that iterative that we spoke about? Has it got back into rates, or where is it coming from?
Yeah.
And so the question of thinking about tweaking or moving those levers. I think I have one final slide, which I won't read to you because I know you're all rushing, but thinking about, pushing on the balloon if you're increasing the property tax credit for some folks, then that money needs to come from somewhere. And absent any other policy changes, it's coming from somebody's property taxes, right? Decreasing it is going to be less money in property tax credit and less money that needs to be raised by the ed fund, all else equal. So I just want to, it's important, I think, to keep that in the back of our mind, that the larger the property tax credit, the more revenue that needs to be raised, which is kind of the converse of what we just worked through, which is decreasing the property tax credit point.
You get a wrap there, or is there?
Thanks, Julia.
Yeah.
Julia.
Thanks, Julia.
Thanks, Marlon.
You're welcome.